HAVN HS420 VGPU might be one of my favourite cases that I built in recently, so much so that I've considered using it as my main build, as my daily driver, installing my PC into it and then just running with it because it's such a nice looking case and such a premium one. Hefty and really good looking, well built and interestingly constructed. It features an interesting design with these angled bottom fans and that deflective shield there that basically blows air from there onto the graphics card, vertical GPU mount, but also options in terms of mounting. You can put a 420mm all-in-one cooler on the top of the case or on the side, for example, and you can use 140mm fans throughout and also have options for installing loads of storage. Now, as you can see, I've built in it in several different ways, with a 3090, a 4090 and a 5090, Corsair fans and NZXT fans, and coolers in different positions as well. So I want to give you thermal performance testing later on and talk to you about that, but also to talk about my experiences with it, the problems I've found with it, the interesting highlights of it, and the things to bear in mind if you're going to use it. You can use up to 140mm fans in here, and I would recommend considering reverse blade fans like Corsair's LX140R, for example, because you can see that you can then do it without having to see the backs of the fans when you've got them set to intake. And it's something interesting to think about with the layer options in here. But I've also installed it with the NZXT Kraken Elite and with standard fans mounted on the bottom. You'll see the difference there, what that makes to the visuals. But it's also interesting because you've got 140mm fans in different positions, but you can use 120mm in some areas in the build. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. There are some issues with it though. For example, it's worth bearing in mind that you can't use Corsair's RMShift power supply in there, because although it's large at the back, the area for the power supply unit just wouldn't allow me to install the shift in it, so you couldn't fit it because of the cables and the way they sit in there. It's not a problem with the Leland Edge though, as I'll show later on. There are some other things as well. So the storage tray can be removed from the side, and then there's a VESA mount that you can use in here. I bought myself a display, but perhaps didn't do the research properly and work it out based on the specs. So it's worth keeping this sort of thing in mind. So I've got this VESA mounted display in here, which I can put in and mount it in this position. You'll notice that it's not quite long enough. So basically the research that I've done wasn't quite enough here in terms of the size of the thing, but it has some interesting areas that you can run cabling through at the top, as you'll see. So it needs an HDMI cable, obviously, to run from the display out to the graphics card. Now you can come in from the top. There's a couple of different places that you can do that and run your cables into it. But what I found with this chunky cable that I'd bought to go with the thing, that it wouldn't fit through that gap and presented a bit of a problem. Now this is more user error than an issue with the case, because you do need to sort of think about that and plan it out. And I don't know how many people would want to mount a display in there. Let me know in the comments if that's something you were thinking about. But what I found was I just couldn't do it. I found this process pretty frustrating because I couldn't get the cable into there and then to plug it in. Now, maybe if I'd run it down to the bottom and plugged it in from below, it wouldn't have been an issue if I'd mounted the screen the other way up, but it definitely led to frustrations and I ended up just giving up on it. Something to bear in mind. Now I want to talk to you about the initial unboxing experience and the design of it, because there's some interesting highlights. You'll see that there are various spots on the case where you can put your hand in it and you can easily lift it up. Now this is worth knowing because it's quite heavy and well constructed in that way, so it's a pretty hefty case, and these sort of areas have come really handy when I've been moving it around constantly when building in it, so that's nice. At the bottom you also have this dust tray which is removable down there. I've been questioned about the dust ingress of this case, but as you'll see there are various points where it has dust filters on it. Now, one of the things that will probably be frustrating over time is the number of screws you have to remove the panels. This front panel, for example, actually requires 4 screws in order to remove it. Then there's 2 more for the back panel, and then another one for the rear panel as well. And they're little screws. Now, this is good because it's securing everything in place, obviously. And as you can see, there's a pretty hefty dust filter at the rear, but it makes for a little bit fiddliness when changing components, or if you want to take it apart to clean it, for example. But it does mean that doors aren't going to fall off and are well secured. As you can see at the rear, there's plenty of different places for the cables to run with pretty small channeling through these various different gaps. There's also recommended spots for running various different cables, and as you can see, there's mention of a storage box, so you can mount storage at the rear there as well. I want to talk about storage a little while, so stick with me for that. But you can run fan cables in different directions and do different things with the layouts here. The channeling is pretty narrow, though. That's one thing I will say. And with a 24-pin power connector, for example, I found that was a bit problematic. You do have these rubber areas here where you can run your cables through, plus these clips, which you can slide around in them to tighten them up and to neaten the cables up, which can be pretty handy. Now, I used the Leland Edge power supply unit for this. This is a 1000-watt power supply, which, as you can see, doesn't take up loads of room in the case. There's still plenty of space in there, and that's one of the nice things about it, is how big it is. With all the Velcro ties and these areas, you can run the cables through pretty easily and then connect them up. Those plastic clips that I showed you earlier on in the video are also present at the top here as well, so you can tidy up those top cables and hide things away pretty nicely. But when it comes to a 24-pin power cable on this power supply, although they're individually braided cables, there isn't a great deal of room here. If you had chunkier, thicker power supply cables with your power supply, it'd be even more problematic trying to make that look neat. But once they're plugged in on the other side, obviously the side that's going to be visible, you can use the clips and those nice rubber slats to basically hide away a lot of the cables and to make things look pretty neat and tidy, which is nice. So in terms of cable management, front ends up looking really clean. And if you're better at it than I am, it'll be even nicer. You also get additional clips included in the box that you can put in the different positions at the top or on the side, and therefore mounting even more cables or tidying things up in nicer ways. So there's some real nice attention to detail with this build and the thought that's gone into it and the accessories that have been included, which is obviously really nice to see. So if you take your time with it, you can end up with a really nice, clean looking setup, as you can see there. Now I want to talk to you about the sort of jigsaw puzzle design of the case and a few things of interest in terms of the way you have to build it in a logical way. Otherwise, you're going to come into problems, as you'll see. There's also some quirks to it. So you can see it's got this removable dust panel at the rear for the bottom fan. But in order to take that off and clean it, you'd first have to take the back panel off entirely, which is a bit of a faff. And to remove the bottom fan mount, you first have to unscrew a tiny little screw at the back and then take that off. And in order to do that, you have to remove the back panel as well. Then when I went to remove the fan brackets, you'll see you've got two fan brackets at the rear, top and bottom. So you have options of mounting 140mm or 120mm fans in here, depending on what you want to do. But in order to remove that fan bracket, you first have to remove the vertical GPU mount because it's blocking one of the screws. So that's in the way. Now, this isn't necessarily an issue because obviously you've got to take this out in order to be able to install the motherboard in there as well. But this thing itself has loads of screws in different positions that you have to remove and obviously remember where they go when it comes to rebuilding the thing. So you have to give some thought to it and plan that out and have somewhere to carefully keep those screws so they don't get lost, and think about that. More on the vertical GPU little mount in a little while because there's some things of interest about it, especially when we get to mounting a 5090, for example. But once that's out of the way, you can then remove that panel. Now, as you can see, these fan brackets also have rubber grommets and plastic washers in the holes there. And those are a little bit iffy in terms of the design because it makes things a little bit tricky and fiddly. And I also found some weird problems with them. So, for example, I got these 140mm NZXT fans to mount there. And I found that there's some nice features in terms of where the cables run. For example, you can see there's a hole here you can run your cables into and then a clip that you can put them into. But what I found is with the standard fan screws for these fans, when you go to install the fans like this, it ended up being an issue. Now, these are 140mm fans, so they should logically fit. You remove that bracket and then you screw the screws into the holes. But what I found is that these fans just wouldn't stay in place for some reason. So despite screwing in all of the screws into these fans, it still just came away. You could just pull it away from there. Now, this was a bit of a quirk because you can see I've got a Montec fan in there instead. Put a 140mm Montec fan in there, no problems. And I managed the same sort of logic with a Leland fan as well. So it seems to be fan specific. So you might not have this issue depending on what fans you're using in the case. But it was a little weird quirk of the design that I discovered during the initial build process. But it's okay because I had some 120mm fans, so I was using those instead. Now you use the brackets when installing 120mm fans because they then screw into that bracket and then the bracket screws back into the case. So depending on what you're doing, you have to use a sort of different logic to it, and following the manual might be a bit confusing. I've got build guides on these two different setups, so if you'd like to find out more, I'll link to it in the description. But obviously with this design, the idea here is to put a exhaust fan at the top, so a fan facing inwards, and screw that in so that the air is going to exhaust out of there as well as at the top, and then an intake fan at the bottom, because if you put an exhaust fan down the bottom, that's going to be a problem. As you can see with the intake fan, we're obviously flipping it the other way around, so you end up with the back facing inwards, which doesn't look ideal. Or you do what I'm doing here with a Corsair 140mm reverse blade fan, mounting that at the bottom so it's nice and neat. Now this wasn't without problems as well, because these fans have some connectors obviously which need to daisy chain from one fan to the next, and because of how the cabling was working here, I found out to use one of the long cables to connect this to other fans in the system, and there's plenty of space to do this, so you can run cables through, but it can be a bit tricky, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But as mentioned, you've got these little plastic washers and then little screws included with the bracket as standard. The plastic washers have to go through into the rubber housing, and then you use fan screws to install it in there. Now I found those little plastic washers ended up breaking in a couple of points. Not a major issue because the fan's still screwed in, and it was probably because obviously I'd gone through multiple installations of different fans in the build, which most people probably wouldn't be doing. You probably install one set of fans and that would be the end of it. But it was one sort of small quality issue that I found with the setup here, which wasn't present in a lot of other places, because this is an expensive case, and for the most part it feels very premium and builds really nicely. But then there was little issues like that, like these back fans, just a bit tricky to install. And then with running the cables through, I'm trying to run this cable from the Corsair fan at the rear through underneath the tray for the bottom fan so that I can then connect it to the end. Now this is an issue more with the length of the Corsair cables than with the design, or perhaps with my planning, because the idea is to daisy chain these fans together. But what I found is there isn't really the length in this cable to stretch out to the very end of the tray. So this is something to think about if you're building in it. More of a commentary on how to connect things up or the logic of what to do when building, because it becomes a bit of a problem in terms of wiring those things in. I'll show you more on that in a minute. But what's interesting about this is, depending on what fans you're installing in the case, there's a couple of PWM fan repeaters in here. These are mounted in two different spots, one at the bottom left here and then one at the top right. They need SATA power and obviously a connection to the motherboard for each of them. And then you have the ability to plug in multiple fans. So there's actually 5 fan ports on here, so you can connect up fans to it. Now, this is intriguing, and I wonder whether people will use them, because obviously there's no RGB connectors on there. So you'll be saving cable management, because you wouldn't have to run as many cables from your fans through to the front and then plug them into the motherboard. Instead, you're just plugging one cable in from the fan repeater and then SATA power at the back. So you'd hide those cables away, but you'd still have to run the RGB connectors if you're using RGB fans. Now, in both my builds, I end up using NZXT's fan controller and then obviously Corsairs, so I didn't use these repeaters, so I can't talk about how effective they are. But if you're using non-RGB fans, or if you're using standard fans with standard power connectors, you could plug them in here and then save some wiring, which would be pretty interesting. Now let's have a look at this vertical GPU mount and the fan setup at the bottom tray. This tray presented me a problem immediately, and again this is because I hadn't looked at the specs properly, but although you can put 120mm fans at the back and top of the case, you can't put 120mm fans on this bottom tray, which meant I couldn't use the F360 core from NZXT, and I couldn't put 120mm fans on there as standard, so I had to use some 140mm fans. Then you have these long screws included with the case. Basically, you're installing the fans onto this tray, and in this instance I'm installing them face down because these are standard fans, and obviously we're going to be installing them like that. Now the nice thing is you'll see the tray has multiple holes in it, so you can run the cables into it through to the bottom and then hide them away. Obviously if you're using Corsair's IQ Link fans, you've only got one cable coming out of them, but if you're using those NZXT ones like I was, you have the ability to hide the fan cables away quite nicely. So you need 140mm fans for this bottom one, and then to think about the logic of that. But if you've got interlocking fans, not an issue, so it works nicely with Corsair's fans here. Lee's would also work quite nicely, pretty easily. And then you just install that tray back in here and set that up. Now, one of the problems I had with this was remembering the logic of it, and this is why I wanted to point this out, because it's thinking about how each thing needs to install in kind of a jigsaw puzzle way. I mentioned, for example, that this tray and the vertical GPU mount were blocking the back fans, so that you couldn't easily uninstall those and then set them up. So you have to think about removing that first before doing that. But I also forgot to install this bracket on the fan tray at one point. So when I was installing it, then I remembered that I'd have to then put this bracket on as well. And this is important, obviously, because it helps to deflect the air. It's designed to help with the airflow from the intake fans to ensure that they're blowing onto the glass and then deflecting up onto the graphics card. So this is quite cool, but it's also problematic in a couple of different ways. Making sure you remember to install it being one of them, and the other one is it getting in the way. So here you can see in the Corsair build that I forgot to install it. I had to then sort of yank the thing out, try and install with it like this, which was awkward rather than having it outside the case, because the cables were obviously wired in for the fans already, so I didn't want to have to take them out completely. So I'm then holding it at an awkward angle while trying to install this while the vertical GPU mount's already in place. Presents a bit of a problem. Again, this is all about planning, but also just the way you have to plan this more than any other case. I found that I just had to work out the order of things a lot more, and remember how to do what bits when. So I'd recommend checking out my build guides on these, because I'll talk you through the steps and how you need to do each of these parts in order to avoid these sorts of problems. But the other issue I've had with this is both the bracket for this and the vertical GPU mount get in the way of the ports for the USB ports, for example. So you also need to think about when you're plugging in your front panel connectors and USB ports and your fan power connectors and other things if they're at the bottom, because the vertical GPU mount and this plastic bit from the fan tray both get in the way of those. So you need to take them out beforehand. Now, in terms of the vertical GPU mount, you can see that you can adjust the position of it. So it either comes forward or backwards towards the front of the case, away from the motherboard. This is okay with a 3090, but when you get to the 5090, which is a chunky boy, this becomes a bit more of a problem, because mounting this in the vertical GPU mount means it's closer to the motherboard. Now, if you look at the 4090, which is the white one, versus the 5090 Astral, you can see it is slightly deeper. Now, this presented an issue here because obviously mounting it into the vertical bracket is fine, but then positioning it in the case so it doesn't get too hot, it requires some thought. Now, the vertical bracket is adjustable, so what you'll see is once it's installed, you can actually slide it forwards and backwards, but you are limited on this by the bracket itself, because it needs to be screwed in from a different thumb screws on the rear and on the front, and obviously also limited by the size of the GPU and then that fan tray as well, so where that panel sits, because then you need to make sure that you're still able to position this fan tray in and have that panel sit in a position where it's not going to be pressing against the graphics card. The other issue I found with this is it's not very easy to do and presented a bit of a problem in that I actually ended up damaging this as well. So it's possible, if you're not careful, to do a little bit of damage to parts of the case when building in it if you're not taking care. So on the left-hand side, at the very edge of the shield here, you can see there's a little bit of a scratch. It's only a minor imperfection. It's barely visible once you start playing around with it, but it is something to bear in mind. Now, using the 5090 was the first issue that I had with the cooling. It runs very hot, as you'd expect, and the problem I found was it was blowing some of that heat onto the motherboard, which then resulted in one of my drives not working anymore. So one of the NVMe SSDs I had installed in the system got too hot and then just stopped responding. Now, this meant that it wasn't recognized by Windows, and then I was in a flat because I'd lost what I thought was loads of footage from my gaming channel, which I was very upset about. But it was a Gen 5 NVMe SSD. Now, these run pretty toasty. The T700 runs quite hot, so you do need good cooling on it. So the heat from the GPU blowing onto it not ideal. Repositioning it in the motherboard away from the fan that's on the back of the GPU helped, but it's something to keep in mind. And I'll talk more about thermal testing later on. One of the surprising features of this case that's really awesome if you love storage is the storage tray, because you can install an insane amount of drives in this case if you're using this and you're not using it for fans or a radiator instead. You've got 4 boxes here, and you can either put a hard drive in each of them, so you get a 4 platter hard drives, or 2 2.5-inch SSDs per bay. So that means 8 potentially total, which is nuts. Obviously, you've got options. You can install a mix. You can install a hard drive in one and then SSDs in the other. Installation for them is really easy as well. The logic's pretty well thought out, so the ports for the connectivity is sort of faced towards the rear, so you can hide a lot of the cables away back there. It's a really nice solid tray. They feel nice and solid and hefty. You obviously have options in terms of what you're installing in there. So if you like storage and you're not going to be using NVMe SSDs, or if you are, but you also want additional drives, then you can do that. So I've already shown different things that you can do with that side tray. You can put a 420mm all-in-one cooler on it. You can put loads of storage on it. If you buy the right size display, you can put a VESA mounted display in there. The VESA mount that I mentioned at the beginning of the video is included in the box, by the way, so you can just put that in there. You just need to make sure you look at the specs on the website or in the description and check out the size of the display that you need for it. So you've got plenty of options for it, and that's one of the nice things I like about it. It's very flexible in terms of what you're doing with it and your own personal preference. I was asked whether you could install fans on here and still have the storage, and obviously you can't do that. But you could maybe mix them in. It's not something I've tried, but you could potentially, let's say, leave one of these storage bays installed on that side tray and then put 2 fans above it, perhaps. I haven't tried it. I don't know how well that would work. It might look weird, but it might also allow you to have 2 SSDs, for example, and then still have fans on the side tray as well, to have a mix of those things in there. So you've got options. You've got plenty of food for thought in terms of that. And as you'll see, this tray also has loops on it. So it's got little Velcro loops for running the cables through. So there's a lot of different areas for running cables through and plugging them in different places and trying to keep things nice and neat in the case. And the size of it means that it can all just be hidden away pretty nicely. Again, there are a lot of screws though. So each of these trays had 2 little screws to install it onto that back tray. And then obviously a lot of screws to install the drives in there as well. And then you've got 3 screws to secure this back thing to the back of it. So there's screws all over the place in this case that you do need to take care not to lose when you're going through the process of installing things, because I just found you have to take off loads of panels with screws. You have to take off screws from various other places. So you need to make sure you're laying things out and keeping them neatly tucked away, and remembering which screws go where, because some of them are different depending on where they're mounting on the panels, but lots of flexibility. And at this stage you can see obviously they've got those drives installed, the power supplies installed, and yet there's still plenty of space at the back for the cabling to be nestled away and hidden away back there. Now the other alternative is to remove this thing entirely, and if you're using NVMe SSDs and you're not bothered about storage, you can just take these trays off. So you can remove them out of the way, and then you can either put fans on this side tray or you can put an all-in-one cooler on there. So you have the option to do that as well. Now I started off with a 420mm all-in-one cooler mounted to the top of the case, but then I wanted to do some testing and see how we got on with it mounted to the side. This is the IQ Link H170 iRGB from Corsair. And so I find side mounting a radiator in a lot of cases is actually beneficial, because it brings cold air in through the rad, cools the radiator down. As long as you either flip the fans over or use reverse blade fans, this can actually be really good for cooling your CPU. And then obviously you can top mount exhaust fans. The one thing I found is if you want to put tubes at the bottom of the radiator in this instance, they're a bit too taut. You can see it's quite tight there, and this presents a problem if you're mounting a graphics card vertically, because that's just a bit problematic. So with the 5090, for example, that just sits too close to the motherboard and would press against those tubes. So I ended up mounting it with it at the top instead. Now, as mentioned, I'm using reverse blade fans now for this setup because of side mounting on there. So reverse blade fans, if you don't know already, these Corsair ones are the LX140Rs. The idea here is the blades are basically facing the opposite direction to standard fans that you can see on the left. And when you mount them on the radiator, they're then acting as intake fans instead of exhaust. So in the current setup, as it is while I'm removing these fans, that would be exhaust. And obviously you don't want to exhaust through the radiator when it's on the side. We want to intake instead. So you either have the option of taking your standard fans and flipping them over, but you then see the backs of the fans on the radiator in the case and it wouldn't look as neat, or you use reverse blade fans like this and install these. Now in a lot of builds I found that this actually improves the performance of CPU cooling, but actually in this case I found it didn't quite as much. And I covered this in the review of the H170i, and I'll show a bit more of it later on this video as well. But actually it was a bit hotter in terms of the CPU when mounted like this, which was unusual. Now I think this is actually down to the back of the case and the dust shielding at the rear, because there's quite a lot of dust protection on that back of the case. It's quite thick, so I think maybe the airflow is not being pulled through quite as well. But I was really surprised by this because I've tested a lot of different builds and I often build in cases in multiple different ways, and yet what I found here was it wasn't running as efficiently as it has done in other builds. That's not to say your experience will be the same. It's going to depend wildly on your CPU and your environmental temperatures and the fans you're using in the radiator and other things. But my finding here was it wasn't as good, which was weird and surprised me. And obviously also going to be impacted by the GPU as well, because with the vertical mounting of the GPU, it's going to be blowing hot air towards the motherboard and towards the AIO potentially, so fighting the cool air that's coming in. So maybe there's some turbulence being presented there. So maybe alternatively putting fans on the tray instead of radiator and having intake fans there along with the bottom ones might be better. And then exhaust out of the top either through the radiator, or we could set it up like this with the 3 fans on the top. Now the top bracket, the radiator tray, can be removed. Again, a couple of screws that hold that in place, and then you can take that out and you can mount your rad to it. And as mentioned, I use both the 360 and 420 millimeter all-in-one cooler on this at a couple of different points. So it's pretty straightforward to do it like that. Take it out, mount your radiator on there, and then install it back in the case. Obviously, you don't have to, though. You could leave this tray in place. And it's nice and large, obviously being able to take both of those options. And there's plenty of space for putting the AIO back in like this and sliding it back into place. Now, the other thing that's interesting and handy about this is the logic of where the cables go. So you can see with this Kraken cooler, for example, I've got these cables facing towards the rear. You've got the nice gap back there. And because you've got that tray attached to it, you can basically lift this up and easily position it so you can run the cables through to the rear and sort them out. So with the Corsair IQ Link setup, for example, what I was trying to do is run the cables from the fans at the back. You can see I've got a cable running through here that I then connect up to the fans on the radiator, with the idea that they then connect to the pump so that you can then connect up multiple fans and daisy chain them together. And then all you've got to do once that's sorted out is to just screw the rad tray back in, and so that's then installed and secured up there. So pretty straightforward to do. But there's also channeling at the top for those cables, as you can see at the top and in different positions around there. And there's plenty of room to be able to hide the cables behind the radiator as well. So when installing those cables from the IQ Link setup, running them behind the radiator, nestling them away quite well at the rear, and then tucking them away. The other issue I had, however, is in the different sort of logics of how I was installing this. The back fans aren't as easy to daisy chain. So what I'd done is daisy chain the bottom fan to the top fan, and then try and run the cable from that to this fan setup, and then from this fan to the rear at the other end. And just the complexities of it makes it a bit difficult to do, especially when you get to the bottom fan tray, which was problematic as well. This meant that I ended up with 2 of Corsair's IQ Link controllers in there. Now, I think if you planned it out a bit better and plugged the cables in earlier and maybe thought about how you're doing it, you could possibly get away with using just one controller. I certainly did the first time I built in this Corsair setup. But once I side mounted the radiator and put extra fans into the case, I ended up having to use 2 controllers. Not because the controllers can't take loads of connections, because you can have up to 24 things connected on there, but because of the number of cables running from different positions in the cases, because the controllers only have 2 ports on them. So again, this is all about planning the build out, but I think it speaks to the complexity of how you connect the rear fans and run the cables through if you're daisy chaining them. So it's not an issue with standard fans, because you could just run the fan cables through from the rear fans. But if you need to use a daisy chain connection, like with the IQ Link setup, where you're connecting one fan to the next fan, to the next group of fans, to the next group of fans, and then into the controller, it just becomes a bit more problematic. However, what you can do is you can run the cables up and out of the top, and then back down and in again. And because of that channeling at the top, as well as the channeling down the sides there, you can see that you can run that up and then back in really easily and then set that up nicely. So there's a lot of areas here with ties and without that you can easily run your cables through and hide them away. So obviously that cable is now plugged in the right hand side and only a small bit of it is visible. So it's much easier to make it really nice and neat. The gap between the 2 fans at the top and the bottom at the back though was large enough that I couldn't use the small standard daisy chain fan to connect the 2 together. So it won't quite reach because it won't plug in properly there. So I ended up having to use one of the longer cables. So this was another problem I had. Again, these are quite niche problems. Obviously, it's only going to be an issue with Corsair's IQ Link fans when you're trying to set them up like this. But you can see it's both a problem and not a problem, because with the long cable that's included with the dual pack of fans that's meant to connect from the fan to the controller, you can just plug them in like this instead. So if you've got spares of this, you can just connect it up like this. And there's plenty of space at the back here. And obviously once you've got the back fan tray back on, you won't even be able to see these cables either, because they'll just be hidden away behind it. So there's plenty of room, and there's also plenty of hooks as well for sort of nestling these things away. So it's really nicely thought out in a number of ways, as you can see from multiple angles and from different builds. It's quite clever, and it's very handy and theoretically easy to build in, assuming you're following the right logic and doing it in the right steps and thoroughly planning out your build. And I think that's it. My commentary is that you really do have to plan out a lot more with this than with other cases I've built in, which is interesting. I've already mentioned the vertical GPU mount, but what you might not realize necessarily is this is a PCIe Gen 5 riser cable running from it rather than Gen 4, which is not standard. It's obviously a new standard, perfect for the 50 series from NVIDIA, and Intel's latest GPUs also are Gen 5, but a lot of older vertical mounts are Gen 4. Also, this setup allows you to run the 12-volt high power connector easily around the back of the case without putting additional pressure on it, so I could plug this in nicely, still have the cable nice and neat, and it's not taut in that setup, so you can end up with it being plugged in nicely without any worries. So now let's get onto the thermal testing and show you some of the things of interest. Obviously, you have to bear in mind these are different specs. So this is with an NZXT build, with the Kraken 360, and with an i9-13900K. Running OCCT, doing a stress test on there, I found that we got up to 85 degrees C in this setup with that top-mounted IAO, which isn't too bad for an i9. And mostly you can see that there's no red indicators in here suggesting a big problem with the overall temperatures, or that it was thermal throttling and having issues there. So it actually did pretty well in this setup. Bearing in mind it's only a 360, that's not too bad. And then obviously swapping that out, I'm now using a Core Ultra 9 285K with a 420mm all-in-one cooler. So obviously these tests are not going to be comparable. Where we're seeing different setup, similar temperatures, around 80 degrees C at the maximum here, so it's actually running cooler. But the Core Ultra 9 does seem to run cooler than an i9 anyway, so just bear that in mind. I'm running a 5090 in there, as I said, as well. And so obviously it's going to get a little bit toasty, and that's one of the negative effects of it. Bear in mind it's vertically mounted too. So running the same tests in both different layouts with a top mounted radiator and then with a side mounted, so I can show you the difference side by side. So initially the scores were okay in Cinebench. They actually dropped a little bit, as you can see, when I side mounted, and the temperatures went up just a small fraction as well, which I was actually surprised by, because usually it's the other way around, but this shows the difference it can make from case to case. So then I ran OCCT, which is a thermal testing tool that runs for absolutely ages. And again, the same sort of thing. The temperature of the CPU was actually hotter when the radiator was side mounted. It's really surprised me because usually in these sorts of tests, in other cases I've tried, it actually ends up being quite a bit cooler. But you can see here we've got a maximum of like 4 degrees more overall on the core temperatures. And so interesting result in this instance, but maybe this case isn't pulling enough air in through the side there. So then I went to TimeSpy Extreme and ran the test again. Another benchmarking test. So this is actually stress testing the system. So rather than just a benchmark, it runs for absolutely ages. So you can put the system under a decent amount of heavy load. And then you can see what the temperatures were there. Now, again, actually the temps are pretty decent here. And I'll show you the temps for standard gaming in a second, because obviously these benchmarks and stress tests put it under more load than you normally would. But what you saw is actually in this instance, it was cooler on the side mount. So it's a couple of degrees cooler overall at the top end of what it was going through. So it was actually running cooler in that instance. So it's some interesting difference between these depending on what stress test you're using and what you're doing. So there can be quite a little fluctuation between those, but there's an interesting difference there. And that was more what I was expecting, a reduction in temperature. And actually it's usually more significant at that. So it's quite interesting there. But you can see that from the stress test itself, you're looking at a little bit of difference between the GPU and the CPU. So you can see the differences here with the side mount and top mount. Now for standard gaming, obviously things are a little bit different. And generally speaking, I found the performance here was quite good. So you'll see that you've got around 54 degrees on the CPU and 66 on the GPU with the setup here. And what I found was basically this was generally the case across most games. Bear in mind, this is with the 5090, the graphics on Ultra. I've got ray tracing and other things set up. Also did Cyberpunk 2077, doing the benchmark on that. Played some PUBG, some Ready or Not, and a lot of other games, all at 4K with maximum graphics to really push the system and see how it got on with it. And then I found getting around 66 degrees maximum on these sorts of tests with standard gaming. So 66 degrees on the CPU is not too bad. And while testing the GPU, I wanted to run a few different games at maximum settings. So Stalker 2 here, for example, this is 4K and ultra settings. You can see here that GPU is basically at around 55 degrees C, 154 FPS. So really decent temperatures there. And then I ran Port Royal as well because I wanted to see how we got on with the testing on that. And what you'll see is that the overall performance of it was really good, and that the GPU temperatures actually weren't too shabby in this setup either. So here we're looking at about 68 degrees C, not too bad. 70 maximum recorded by hardware info, 64. So it is toastier definitely in the 3090 or 4090 as you'd expect, but not terrible. And then Ready or Not as well. So lots of different games tested, and generally the experience is around 60 to 70 degrees C max. Obviously with that vertical GPU mount, it's not going to get as good, especially the size of the thing, but the AIO might be making a difference to that as well. So the conclusion is overall a really nice case. As I said, definitely would consider switching my main daily driver into this PC case. It's just been a really nice one to use, really good looking. It runs nice and quiet as well, depending on what fans you've got set up in it. Didn't get massively toasty, I don't think, and performs really well. Just a few little issues along the way, but nothing that's going to be a major problem long term, I don't think. This has been the Provoked Prawn. I hope you found this useful. Check out the description to find out more about the specs of the builds and other things. Thanks for watching.